At 3:47 in the morning, Corporal James Harland stood beside a cold artillery piece on a nameless stretch of Burmese highland and understood that following his orders precisely would kill everyone. The fog lay thick across the valley floor. 7 enemy trucks sat motionless in the darkness below, positioned with the kind of geometric intention that exists only in ambush. In 90 minutes, 43 Allied vehicles would move through that killing ground, unaware and undefended. Harland had explicit instructions. Observe, report, do not engage. He had no crew, no authorization, no backup. And he had 9 decades of military doctrine telling him that what he was considering was not merely inadvisable, it was impossible. The Howitzer squatted on its trails like something forgotten. An M116 pack howitzer, 75mm bore, designed for a crew of 6. Harland had been alone with it for 11 hours. His regular crew, Privates Kowalski, Mendez, Chan, and the others, had been struck down by something the medics were calling acute gastroenteritis but which everyone else simply called the sickness. It had moved through the battalion like smoke through canvas, leaving men hollow and gray. The replacement crew that was supposed to arrive at dusk never materialized. No radio call, no runner, no explanation. Just the ongoing silence of a supply line stretched too thin across too much hostile terrain. Harland stood in the observer's position, his field glasses pressed against the metal surround of the windscreen, and watched the valley resolve itself into clarity as his night vision deepened. The fog was patchy, breaking apart in the pre-dawn thermals, then reforming. Through the gaps he could see the road, a thin scar of packed earth that wound through the lowland between 2 forested ridges. Leto Road, they called it, though he suspected the name was an invention of someone back at Division who needed to put labels on maps. The locals probably had another name for it or no name at all. The trucks were Type 97s. He had seen enough of them in intelligence briefings to recognize the silhouette. The high cab, the flatbed, the spare tire mounted on the rear gate. Japanese logistics vehicles, each capable of carrying 2 tons of cargo or 20 men. They were positioned with deliberate care. 3 on the northern side of the road, tucked into the tree line where the shadows were deepest. 4 on the southern side, staggered at intervals that would create overlapping fields of fire. The spacing was textbook. Whoever had positioned them understood how to maximize the killing zone while minimizing exposure. Harland lowered the field glasses and checked his watch. 3:50. The convoy was scheduled to pass through at 5:30, assuming it had maintained speed through the night. 43 trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, rations, and replacement parts for the forward elements fighting near Mandalay. The convoy represented 3 weeks of accumulation at the depot in Leto, hauled across 800 miles of the worst roads in Asia. Losing it would not merely inconvenience the offensive. It would cripple it. He had been on this position for 6 days. The artillery observer post was a hastily scraped depression at the ridgeline, reinforced with sandbags that had already begun to rot in the humidity. The howitzer sat 20 meters behind him, camouflaged under a torn section of parachute silk that did nothing to hide it from anyone with functioning eyes. His orders were surveillance and interdiction support. Watch the road. Report enemy movement. Provide fire support if authorized by battalion. Maintain radio silence except for priority traffic. The radio was useless. He had discovered that at nightfall when he attempted to report his crew's absence. The terrain here created dead zones, pockets where the signal simply vanished into the hills. He could receive broken fragments of division traffic, enough to know the net was active, but his own transmissions went nowhere. He had tried multiple frequencies, adjusted the antenna, checked every connection. Nothing. The radio was functional. The geography was not. That left runners. But the nearest command post was 4 miles through jungle that belonged to no one reliably at night. Sending a runner meant leaving the gun unattended or going himself, and both options violated his standing orders. He was to maintain observation until relieved. No exceptions. So he had watched. He had logged vehicle movements in his field notebook, tracked Japanese patrol patterns, noted the times when their activity intensified and when it dropped to nothing. He had eaten cold rations, rationed his water, and ignored the fact that his replacement crew had become a bureaucratic ghost. The army was like that. Things that were supposed to happen often did not, and you adapted or you failed. The Japanese trucks had arrived 2 hours before midnight. He had heard them first. The distinctive growl of diesel engines laboring uphill, the mechanical whine of transmissions downshifting. Then he had seen their lights, faint and intermittent, as they navigated the southern approach. They had moved without haste, as if the darkness itself granted immunity. When they reached the ambush site, they had simply stopped, killed their engines, and gone silent. Harland had logged it, noted the time, the number of vehicles, their approximate positions. He had attempted to radio it in, received only static, and accepted that the information would go no further tonight. At that point, the trucks were simply a data point. Enemy logistics movement, possibly supply, possibly reinforcement. Not his concern beyond documentation. Then the crews had dismounted, and he had understood. Through the field glasses he had watched them work. They moved with the efficiency of soldiers executing a rehearsed plan. From the truck beds they unloaded heavy weapons. Type 92 machine guns, recognizable by their distinctive tripods and the bulky ammunition boxes. They positioned them in a crescent formation bracketing the road. Interlocking fire. No dead ground. The kind of setup that would reduce a convoy to burning wreckage in under 2 minutes. Harland had watched them settle into their fighting positions, watched them camouflage the gun emplacements with cut vegetation, watched them test their fields of fire with handheld aiming stakes. They were thorough, they were competent, and they were waiting for something specific. The convoy. It had to be. Intelligence about Allied movements was never perfect, but it existed. Prisoner might talk. A local might inform. Patrol might observe and report. The Japanese knew something was coming, and they had positioned themselves to destroy it. He calculated times and distances in his head. The convoy would take the western route because the eastern was impassable after the rains. It would travel at night to avoid air attack. It would reach this stretch of road approximately 90 minutes before full dawn, when visibility was worst and reaction time lowest. The timing was not accidental. Harland returned to the Howitzer. The fog was thickening again, settling into the low ground like something alive. He could no longer see the road clearly, only the vague shapes of terrain. The Japanese positions were invisible. That meant they could not see him either, but it also meant that any attempt to engage would be firing into conditions that made accuracy nearly impossible. He crouched beside the trail spade, the rear support that anchored the gun during firing, and checked its seating. Solid. The ground here was clay mixed with decomposed granite. Hard enough to hold, but not so hard it would shift under recoil. He moved to the breech and opened it, checking the bore by feel. Clean. The last fire mission had been 3 days ago, harassing fire on a suspected staging area. 6 rounds, no observed effect, standard wastage. He had cleaned the gun afterward because there was nothing else to do and because neglecting a weapon in this climate meant waking up to rust. The ammunition was stored in a dugout covered with a tarpaulin. 24 high-explosive rounds, impact-fused, each weighing 14 pounds. For smoke rounds, useful for screening or marking but irrelevant now. And 8 illumination rounds that he could not use because lighting up the valley would simply announce his position to every Japanese soldier within visual range. He ran through the mathematics. The range to target was approximately 1,200 meters. Elevation angle would be minimal. This was direct fire, more like an anti-tank gun than traditional artillery. The Howitzer's maximum effective range was 8,000 meters, but that assumed indirect fire with a forward observer calling corrections. Shooting alone at night into fog, he would be working essentially by dead reckoning. A 6-man crew could sustain a rate of fire of 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Alone, Harland estimated he could manage 1 round every 45 seconds if he moved efficiently and accepted a total breakdown of safety protocol. The physical sequence was brutal. Extract the round from storage, carry it to the gun, load it into the breech, close and lock the breech block, aim using the hand crank and elevating wheel, fire, absorb the recoil, open the breech, extract the spent casing, repeat. Each step required strength, precision, and time. Doing it alone was not doctrine. It was barely possible. Doctrine. The word sat in his mind like a stone. He had been trained at Fort Sill, where the artillery school reduced warfare to trigonometry and timing. Every procedure was codified. Every action had a prescribed method. The logic was sound. Artillery was a mathematical weapon, and mathematics required discipline. Men who improvised got their crews killed. Men who followed procedure won battles. But Doctrine assumed you had a crew. It assumed you had communications. It assumed that the system, the vast hierarchical machine of command and control, was intact and functional. Here now the system had failed. His crew was gone. His radio was silent. The convoy was inbound. And the enemy was waiting. He checked his watch again. For 80 minutes until the convoy entered the killing zone, assuming it maintained schedule. But convoys rarely maintain schedule. Mechanical breakdowns, navigation errors, a single vehicle sliding off the road in the dark. Any of those could delay them or advance them. He might have 2 hours. He might have 30 minutes. The regulations were explicit. Fire missions required authorization from a commissioned officer. Firing without authorization was grounds for court-martial. Firing alone violated crew safety standards, artillery doctrine, and basic common sense. If he fired and caused casualties, he would be held responsible. If he fired and hit nothing, he would be disciplined for wasting ammunition and compromising his position. If he fired and revealed the location of the artillery position, the enemy would respond with mortars or infantry assault, and he would die alone on this hill for no strategic gain. But if he did nothing, the convoy would drive into an ambush. 43 trucks, hundreds of men, supply lines that could not be reconstituted. The calculus was simple even if the regulations were not. Harland stood beside the gun and looked down into the fog. Somewhere in that gray emptiness were 7 trucks and perhaps 100 soldiers who believed they held the advantage. They were dug in, camouflaged, prepared. They had done everything correctly. By every reasonable measure, they should succeed. The intellectual problem fascinated him even as it horrified him. This was not a question of courage or conviction. It was a question of process. The military existed as a hierarchy specifically to prevent individual soldiers from making strategic decisions. A corporal was not supposed to assess threat patterns, evaluate rules of engagement, or determine acceptable risk. That was for officers, for staff, for the people who saw the entire board and not just one piece. But the people who saw the entire board were not here. He walked back to the observation post and scanned the valley one more time. The fog was beginning to thin at the edges, where the pre-dawn thermals were strongest. In an hour, the visibility would improve. In 2 hours, it would be full dawn, and the convoy would be long past this point, either intact or destroyed. Harland returned to the Howitzer and began his preparations. First, ammunition. He carried 4 rounds from the dugout to the gun position, staging them within arm's reach of the breech. High explosive, impact fused. He verified each round visually and by touch. No cracks in the casing, no damage to the fuse. One defective round could jam the breech or cause a catastrophic misfire. He set them carefully on a square of canvas, noses oriented away from the gun. Second, fire control. He moved to the aiming station and unlocked the traversing mechanism, the hand crank that shifted the barrel laterally. The gun was currently oriented northwest, covering a section of road 300 meters north of the actual ambush site. He would need to traverse right, approximately 15 degrees, to bring the muzzle to bear on the target zone. He made the adjustment slowly, counting the crank rotations, then locked it. Third, elevation. He crouched at the elevating wheel and adjusted the barrel angle. The howitzer sights were calibrated for indirect fire, shooting at targets beyond visual range based on map coordinates and mathematical calculation. For this he would be shooting direct fire, essentially aiming the gun like a rifle. He set the elevation low, almost flat, and locked the wheel. Fourth, final checks. He inspected the recoil mechanism, the hydraulic cylinder that absorbed the gun's rearward momentum during firing. It was functional. He checked the breech block's locking lugs, the metal teeth that sealed the chamber during firing. Solid. He verified that the firing lanyard, the cord that triggered the primer, was properly attached and free of tangles. He looked at his watch. 4:32. The gun was ready. He was not Harland stood in the silence and considered what he was about to do. Not the tactical question that was resolved. The moral one. He was preparing to kill men who had done nothing to him personally, men who were themselves following orders, men who believed they were defending something worth defending. The fact that they were designated enemies by governments and treaties did not make them abstract. They were human, and he was about to try to erase them from the world using mathematics and high explosives. War college ethics would call this a legitimate military action. The enemy combatants were armed, positioned for attack, and represented an immediate threat. Engaging them was not murder. It was warfare. But Harland was not operating within the structures that legitimized warfare. He was acting alone, without orders, without oversight. If he fired, he would be crossing a line that separated soldiers from vigilantes. The only difference was that he wore a uniform and carried authorization that he was explicitly violating. He thought about the convoy, drivers who had been awake for 20 hours navigating roads that barely existed. Infantry replacements who had survived the Pacific Theater only to be reassigned to Burma. Medics carrying plasma and morphine and sulfa powder. Mechanics with spare parts for tanks and trucks and radios. None of them knew they were driving toward annihilation. None of them could defend themselves. The decision was made. It had been made the moment he saw the ambush forming and understood that no help would arrive in time. Everything after that was just the mechanical process of implementation. At 4:45, Harland loaded the first round. He lifted it from the canvas, 14 pounds of metal and explosive, and carried it to the breech. The round was a fixed type, meaning the projectile and propellant casing were assembled as a single unit. He aligned it with the chamber and slid it forward until it seated against the forcing cone. Then he closed the breech block, a horizontal sliding wedge that locked with a solid metallic click. The gun was loaded. He moved to the aiming station and peered through the sight. The fog obscured everything. He could see perhaps 50 meters downslope, then nothing but gray. He was about to fire into invisibility and hope that geometry would compensate. Harland knelt at the trail spade and braced himself. In a normal crew, the gunner aimed, the loader handled ammunition, and the other four managed everything else. Here, he was all of them simultaneously. When the gun fired, the recoil would send it backward despite the spade's anchor. He would need to reposition it before the next shot. That meant physical effort between every round. Aiming, firing, resetting, loading. The cycle would exhaust him quickly. He wrapped his hand around the firing lanyard and pulled. The howitzer erupted. The sound was not the cinematic boom of movie artillery but something sharper and more violent. A crack that seemed to split the air itself. The gun leapt backward against its trails, the recoil mechanism absorbing most of the energy but not all. A jet of flame and smoke blasted from the muzzle, briefly illuminating the hillside in harsh orange light. Then darkness and silence returned, broken only by the ringing in his ears. Harland opened the breech. The spent casing ejected automatically, clattering onto the ground beside the gun. He ignored it. He was already moving to the ammunition, lifting the second round, carrying it to the breech. Load, close, fire. The second round went downrange 8 seconds after the first. He had no way to observe the impacts. The fog swallowed everything. He was firing blind, trusting his initial calculations and accepting that some rounds would miss entirely. But some might not. Third round. His shoulders were already beginning to ache from the repetitive lifting. The gun was not designed to be manhandled by one person. Each component, the barrel, the breech, the trails, was heavy enough to require multiple soldiers to emplace and operate. He was asking his body to do the work of 6 men, and his body was protesting. Fourth round. He adjusted the elevation slightly, raising the barrel 2 degrees. If the first rounds had fallen short, this would correct. If they had fallen long, this would overshoot. He had no way to know. He was throwing metal into darkness and hoping for geometry. Fifth round. The rhythm was becoming automatic now. His mind disconnected from the individual actions and focused on the sequence. Lift, carry, load, close, fire. The gun had become an extension of his body, a tool he operated without conscious thought. Sixth round. A different sound reached him through the ringing in his ears, a secondary explosion, muffled by distance and fog. Something downslope had detonated. A fuel tank, an ammunition store, something volatile. He had hit one of the trucks. Seventh round. Adjust traverse left, 3 degrees. Spread the fire across the ambush position. The Japanese would be scattering now, abandoning their prepared positions, trying to find cover from an invisible attacker. Some would run toward the trucks. Some would run away. Some would freeze and do nothing. Eighth round. Another explosion. Closer together, sharper. A sympathetic detonation, one blast triggering another. The trucks had been loaded with something explosive, ammunition or grenades, and now they were consuming themselves. Ninth round. Harland's hands were shaking from exertion. His back screamed. His ears had gone from ringing to a dull pressure that made all sound seem distant and muffled. But the gun kept firing because he kept feeding it, and it did not care about his discomfort. 10th round. Traverse right. Engage the southern group. The mental map in his head showed 3 trucks on the north side, 4 on the south. He had been hammering the northern position. Now he shifted to bracket the southern one. 11th round. The fog was thinning noticeably now. Pre-dawn light was beginning to filter through, turning the gray to pale silver. Soon he would have visual confirmation of what he had done. He was not certain he wanted it. 12th round. A longer pause this time. He was slowing down, his body unable to maintain the initial pace. The ammunition felt heavier. The breech felt stiffer. Everything was friction and resistance. 13th round. Another secondary explosion, this one larger. A column of smoke punched through the fog, black and oily, rising vertically before the wind sheared it apart. That was a fuel fire. He had destroyed another truck. 14th round. Adjust elevation. Lower trajectory. The first rounds had been arcing shots designed to drop onto the target zone. Now he flattened the angle, turning the howitzer into a direct-fire weapon. These rounds would travel line of sight, impacting whatever they encountered first. 15th round. His ammunition was running low. He had started with 24 high-explosive rounds. 9 remained. He needed to make them count. 16th round. Traverse back to center. Hammer the middle of the ambush position. Deny them any safe ground. 17th round. The fog was thin enough now that he could see the road. Not clearly, but enough to perceive movement or the absence of it. The Japanese position was obscured by smoke and terrain, but the road itself was empty. No tracks. No convoy. Not yet. 18th round. Harland forced himself to slow down. Accuracy over volume. He checked his aim carefully, adjusted for wind, verified his elevation, then fired. 19th round. The sun was coming. The eastern horizon was turning from black to deep blue, the first stage of dawn. In 30 minutes it would be light enough to see clearly. In 30 minutes this would be over. 20th round. Another hit. He could hear it now, the sharp crack of impact followed by the deeper rumble of secondary explosion. Something had detonated catastrophically. The entire southern truck group was likely destroyed or disabled. 21st round. 3 rounds left. He traversed the gun slowly, searching for targets he could not see, trusting memory and mathematics. 22nd round. 2 left. 23rd round. 1 left. Harland loaded the final round and paused. The valley was burning. He could see the smoke clearly now, thick columns rising from multiple points along the road. The fog was breaking apart in the heat, creating weird patterns of visibility. He could see trees, sections of road, shadows that might be vehicles or might be terrain. He aimed the gun one last time, choosing his point of impact with care. The northern tree line where the first 3 trucks had been positioned. If any of them remained operational, they represented the greatest threat. He fired. The howitzer cracked for the 24th time, and then there was silence. The barrel was hot enough that he could feel the heat radiating from it even at arm's length. The breech was fouled with propellant residue. The ground around the gun was littered with spent casings, 24 brass cylinders glinting in the growing light. Harland opened the breech for the final time and let the last casing eject. Then he walked to the observation post and raised his field glasses. The valley was a disaster. At least 4 trucks were burning outright. Their fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. 2 others were clearly destroyed, their frames twisted by explosions. The 7th was harder to identify. It might have been intact, or it might have been obliterated so completely that nothing recognizable remained. The ambush position was scorched earth. The carefully camouflaged machine gun emplacements were exposed and abandoned. The road itself was cratered and impassable. And there were no people. The Japanese had withdrawn. Whether they had retreated in good order or fled in panic, he could not tell. But they were gone. Harland checked his watch. 5:28. 2 minutes later he heard the convoy. The sound reached him before the sight. The combined growl of 43 engines laboring uphill, transmissions grinding through low gears, the squeal of brakes as the lead vehicles slowed for the approach. Then the trucks appeared, emerging from the western tree line in a long column, their headlights still burning against the dawn. They drove past the ambush site without slowing. From his vantage point Harland could see their route clearly. They passed within meters of the destroyed Japanese trucks, apparently unaware or unconcerned. The lead vehicle paused briefly, the driver probably registering the smoke and debris, then continued. The rest of the convoy followed. It took 11 minutes for all 43 trucks to pass through. Harland watched every one. Supply trucks, troop carriers, fuel tankers, a wrecker for recovering broken-down vehicles, and at the rear a command car with its distinctive antenna array. They rolled past the killing ground and continued east, toward Mandalay and the war that was still waiting for them. None of them stopped. None of them investigated. They simply drove past the evidence of violence they had unknowingly avoided and disappeared into the morning. When the last truck vanished over the eastern rise, Harland returned to the Howitzer and began cleaning it. The barrel needed to be swabbed. The breech needed to be wiped down. The recoil mechanism needed to be checked for damage. The gun had been fired 24 times in approximately 18 minutes, well beyond its recommended sustained rate. It deserved care. He worked methodically the way he had been trained. Disassemble the breech. Clean each component. Reassemble. Check function. Lubricate the moving parts. Inspect for cracks or stress fractures. Everything in its proper sequence, because procedure was what separated functional equipment from scrap metal. At 7:30, a runner arrived from battalion. A private whose name Harland did not catch, out of breath from the climb, carrying a message that the replacement crew would arrive by noon, and also where the hell had he been last night because someone had reported hearing artillery fire and the observation post was supposed to be maintaining radio silence. Harland gave him the field notebook with its log of enemy vehicle positions, noted times, and observed activity. He mentioned the Japanese trucks. He mentioned the fire mission. He did not mention that he had conducted the fire mission alone, because the runner did not ask and Harland saw no reason to volunteer information that would only create complications. The runner left. Harland resumed cleaning the gun. The replacement crew arrived at 1300. 6 men, fresh from the depot, who had gotten lost twice trying to find the position and were sunburned and irritable. Their sergeant took one look at the spent casings on the ground, counted them, and asked who had authorized a fire mission. Harland explained what had happened. The ambush, the convoy, the timing. The sergeant listened without interrupting, his face expressionless. When Harland finished, the sergeant said he would file a report and that Harland should return to the company area and await further instruction. 3 days later, a patrol from the reconnaissance company passed through the valley and confirmed the destroyed Japanese vehicles. 7 Type 97 trucks, burned or blown apart. Heavy weapons scattered across the area. No bodies, the Japanese removed their casualties, but enough blood trail to indicate significant casualties. The ambush position was documented, photographed, and logged in the intelligence summary. No one asked Harland about it. Command acknowledged the fire mission in paperwork. Incident report, ammunition expenditure, tactical summary. But there was no follow-up. No commendation. No court-martial. No official recognition of any kind. The bureaucratic machinery processed the event, filed it appropriately, and moved on. Harland returned to regular duties. He served out his remaining time in Burma without distinction. When the Japanese surrendered in August, he was in a supply depot outside Rangoon, inventorying vehicle parts. He rotated home in November, received his discharge in December, and by January 1946 he was a civilian again. He never spoke about Leto Road. Not to family, not to friends, not to the veterans organizations that occasionally sent him recruitment letters. The event had no public record beyond dry military paperwork that would eventually be boxed and archived and forgotten. There was no story to tell. A corporal had fired a gun at some trucks in the dark, and those trucks did not accomplish their mission. Simple logistics, small scale, unimportant, but 43 trucks had reached their destination. Ammunition had been distributed to units that needed it. Medical supplies had saved lives. Rations had sustained soldiers. The offensive had continued without disruption. Harland understood that his violation of doctrine had worked only because of circumstance. The fog had concealed his position. The terrain had favored defense. The Japanese had withdrawn rather than assault. Any of those factors could have been different, and then he would have died for nothing. He had been lucky, and luck was not strategy. But he also understood that doctrine existed to manage uncertainty, and uncertainty could not always be managed. Sometimes the system failed. Sometimes the rules produced outcomes worse than their violation. And sometimes a single person had to decide which failure to accept, the failure of obedience or the failure of inaction. Command had recognized this, he thought. That was why there had been no commendation and no punishment. To commend him would be to endorse violation of doctrine. To punish him would be to declare that following orders mattered more than mission success. So they had done neither. They had acknowledged the reality that military systems were human constructs, imperfect and sometimes inadequate, and that soldiers would occasionally need to operate outside those systems to preserve them. It was not heroism. It was necessity made invisible by its own success. If the ambush had succeeded, the convoy's destruction would have been documented extensively. After-action reports, investigation boards, recommendations for procedural changes. But success left no evidence. The convoy had arrived intact because nothing had happened to it, and nothing that did not happen generated no records. Harland lived another 42 years. He worked as a civil engineer, married, raised 2 children, retired, and died quietly in 1987. His obituary mentioned his military service in a single line. No one who attended his funeral knew about Leto Road. The story died with him, which was appropriate. Some things matter precisely because they remain unrecognized. War is made of visible actions. Battles fought, territory captured, casualties inflicted. But war is decided by invisible ones. Supplies delivered, ambushes prevented, decisions made in darkness by people whose names appear nowhere. The victories that leave no evidence are not lesser. They are simply different, and they are far more common than anyone wishes to believe. On a hillside in Burma, there is nothing to mark where Corporal James Harland stood with a howitzer and chose judgment over obedience. The gun is gone. The position is overgrown. The road still exists, but it carries different traffic now. Nothing remains except the fact that one morning in February 1945, 43 trucks full of soldiers and supplies passed safely through a valley where they should have been destroyed. They passed without knowing they had been saved. And the man who saved them never told anyone what that cost. That is the nature of the unseen decision. It must be made anyway. If this story left you thinking, I'd appreciate your support. Please subscribe to this channel if you'd like to hear more untold stories from history, the ones that don't make the textbooks but matter just as much. Hit the like button if this narrative resonated with you. And let me know in the comments. If you had been in Corporal Harland's position, with clear orders not to fire and a convoy approaching certain death, would you have followed your orders or trusted your judgment? I'm genuinely curious where you draw that line.